Hi, welcome to the video, What's a Blind Analysis? I should mention up front that while this video explains what a blind analysis is, it also gives an introductory overview of how experimental particle physicists analyze data. So, if you're interested in knowing how experimentalists get results from their data, this video is for you. Okay, so let's say we're experimental particle physicists working at a collider experiment. We collide beams of particles inside a particle detector, represented here as a cylinder, as they tend to be cylindrical. To give a few examples of possible things experimentalists do at collider experiments, we could imagine that we're doing any of the following. We could be trying to measure the branching fraction of the Higgs boson to BB bar, so that's the fraction of the time that the Higgs boson decays to a B quark and a B antiquark. Or we could be measuring the lifetime of the tau lepton. Or we could be searching for a dark matter candidate predicted by some physics model, and so on. In each case, there's a particle physics process that we're interested in. This is called our signal process. Unfortunately, there are also boring processes that can mimic the process we're interested in. I say that they're boring because they're typically processes that are expected and have been studied extensively before. These are called background processes. Now, when particles collide and produce particles picked up by the detector, this is called an event. What we would like to do is the following. We'd like to study our signal process, and we'd like to ignore our background processes. Unfortunately, if we look at a particular event, we can't tell with absolute certainty what process led to it. But we can identify typical characteristics of signal and background events to tell them apart statistically. So we can keep events that look more like our signal process and throw out ones that look more like background. The sample of events we keep will disproportionately contain signal events and disproportionately reject background events. To illustrate, let's imagine we take our set of events. Some of them are signal and some of them are background. Typically, the number of signal events is way smaller than the number of background events, so the fraction labeled signal here is much larger than it would be in a real-life situation. If we look at a specific event, we don't know for certain if it's from a signal or a background process. But we can choose events that have the typical characteristics of signal. So we choose a sample of these signal-like events. Our sample will still contain some background events because some background events look a lot like signal events. And there will be signal events which don't make it into our chosen sample because they look too much like background. So, to put it succinctly, our chosen sample will not be purely made of signal events, and the events we reject will not be purely background events. Statistically, we always reject some signal and keep some background, so our selection will not be perfect. In choosing our sample, we could decide to keep only those events that really look like signal. So in this case, we keep rather little signal, but extremely little background. We end up with a smaller sample of events which has a high signal purity. Alternatively, we could decide to adopt a looser selection and keep events that look pretty much like signal. Then we end up with a larger sample, which contains a lot of signal and a lot of background events. We might want to do this if our analysis requires that we have a large statistical sample. Whether we take a high purity or high statistics strategy, or opt for somewhere in between, can depend on how easy it is to discriminate signal from background and on systematic uncertainties. Additionally, we can choose our sample based on different characteristics of signal and background events and on combinations of those characteristics. This means that there is no unique way to do an analysis. Choices need to be made, and those choices will affect the reported result. Hopefully, there is a range of choices where the reported result doesn't depend too much on the choices we make, but still, some dependence will exist. So, humans have to make choices about how to analyze the experimental data. And when humans have to make choices, there is a potential for bias to creep in and contaminate the reported results. In particular, preconceived ideas about what value the quantity being measured should have can bias results. If you have, or believe you have, knowledge of what the experimental result will be, it can bias the way you analyze the experimental data. Clearly, it is extremely important to avoid this. How can pre-existing ideas about what the value of a quantity should be bias the result you're producing? Let's say you're doing an experimental analysis. You come up with 2 different methods for doing the analysis. If you know what result each method gives, you might be biased to choose the method that gives an experimental result that is closer to your preconceived notion because it seems more correct. This is bad. Okay, so what pre-existing information might lead to bias? First, you might have a prediction from the standard model or a particular model of new physics. Second, there might be a previous measurement of the same quantity by another experiment or even by the same experiment on a previous data set. So here we're going to talk about one of the basic tools physicists use to minimize bias: the blind analysis. You might have heard about blind analyses in the context of the recent measurement by the Fermilab Muon G-2 experiment. If not, you might want to check out a video they made on the topic, the link to which is in the upper right corner and in the video description below. Okay, here's the basic idea of a blind analysis. Decisions about how the data should be analyzed should be made without knowledge of how those decisions affect the experimental result. Now, I should note that there do exist some scenarios in which an analysis cannot be done blind. But if an analysis can be blind, it should be. In this video, we'll do the following. We'll give an overview of what is called Monte Carlo simulation in particle physics, talk about what a blind analysis is, and discuss some complications that can arise in doing a blind analysis. Okay, so to understand how most particle physics measurements are made, we need to talk about something called Monte Carlo simulations. Okay, so we want to make decisions on how to analyze our experimental data without knowing what experimental result we'll get. In order to do this, we produce simulated data sets and make decisions on how to analyze the real experimental data based on what we learn from them. These simulated data sets, which are sometimes called simulated data or Monte Carlo simulations or just Monte Carlo, simulate the signal and background processes that we need to understand. Also, and this is likely not obvious, they need to simulate the response of our particle detector to particle physics events resulting from those processes. To illustrate, let's look at a particularly simple process. Here, an electron and a positron collide to produce a Z boson and a photon. The Z then decays into a muon and an antimuon. Let's look at this process in the context of LEP, an E plus E minus collider that ran in the 90s. Here's a Feynman diagram for this process. Either the positron or the electron radiates a photon. Then the electron and positron collide to form a Z. That Z then decays to a mu plus, mu minus pair. This process has three particles, namely a mu plus, a mu minus, and a photon in its final state. And the invariant mass of the mu plus, mu minus pair should be approximately the mass of the Z, which is 91.2 GeV over c squared. Okay, let's look at the steps that we need to go through in simulating this process. First, we use particle physics calculations to calculate 1. How often this process happens, and 2. The probability distributions for the energies and angles of the final state muon, antimuon, and photon. Second, we probabilistically generate simulated events according to these distributions. Third, we simulate how each of these particles interacts with the detector. Importantly, we must simulate both the physics and how the detector responds to it. Okay, let's look at two candidate E plus E minus goes to Z photon events, where the Z goes to mu plus mu minus, from the Aleph experiment at LEP. Here are two of these candidate events. One is shown in the three images on the left, and one is shown in the three images on the right. The detector was cylindrical, so the main picture you see for each event is a cross-section of the cylindrical detector. And then there are also two side views for each event. The initial E plus E minus pair collide along the axis of the cylinder. So the incoming electron and positron beams would be pointing into and out of the screen, in the middle of the round images. Okay, so charged particles, like muons and antimuons, leave tracks in the detector. On the other hand, neutral particles, like the photon, do not. If you look closely, you can see in each event a green track and a red track. The green track is made by the mu minus, and the red track is made by the mu plus. If you look even more closely, you'll see that the tracks are made up of a bunch of little dots, called hits. These are places where the detector has registered interactions with the mu plus and mu minus. These hits are strung together to build the resulting tracks. Okay, So we have these two tracks in each of these two events. But why do we believe the particles that made these tracks are muons, as opposed to some other type of particle? Well, most particles produced in the detector are stopped in the material of the detector. Muons, however, survive to make it all the way out to the outer parts of the detector. For this reason, the detector has, on its outer circumference, subdetectors called muon chambers. Only the muon chambers that registered hits are shown in the main display for each event. You can see that each track extends all the way out to these muon chambers. Hence, the particles are identified as muons. Okay, and now what about the photon? As it's neutral, it doesn't leave a track. But it does leave a deposit of energy in the electromagnetic calorimeter. Those deposits are shown in little histograms inside the white circles. Other neutral particles can also leave energy in the electromagnetic calorimeter. The details of the deposit can be examined to ID the particle. These were identified as photons. Also, we pointed out that we expect the muon-antimuon pair in these events to have an invariant mass compatible with that of the Z boson, which is 91.2 GeV over c squared. The uncertainty on the measured mass is of order 1 GeV over c squared. If we look at the mu plus mu minus invariant mass in each of these events, it is compatible with that of a Z boson. Okay, so we've looked at these two events. There's one more thing to point out. The event on the left is an actual event registered by the actual Aleph detector. The one on the right is a simulated Monte Carlo event. So I want to emphasize that our simulated data samples have to have all of the detail needed to successfully do an analysis. They need to be almost indistinguishable from real data. We need the simulated data sets to simulate the particle physics processes, the response of the detector to the particles produced, and mismeasurements. In the real detector, the measured energies and momenta will have errors. And in the real detector, particles will be misidentified. The simulation has to be accurate enough to reflect this. In other words, the Monte Carlo even needs to get things wrong in the same way the detector does. Lastly, I should note that the process we looked at here is one that is particularly easy to simulate. Processes at the LHC experiments are much more complicated. Okay, so now we are ready to talk about the basic, really idealized picture of a blind analysis. To be concrete, let's say we're looking for a hypothetical particle, which we'll call X. The X is predicted in a specific model of new physics. The model specifies the X mass, how the X particle can be produced, and how it will decay. Through studies, it is determined that, if the X particle exists, it should be produced in our experiment. So, we produce Monte Carlo simulations of our signal process, which is the production and subsequent decay of the X particle. We also produce Monte Carlo simulations of all relevant background processes that we could mistake for X production. We generate an enormous number of simulated events. We then examine our simulated signal X events and simulated background events to find ways in which they systematically differ. For example, we might look at the angular distributions of particles. Or we might look for a set of particles from an X decay that have an invariant mass compatible with the X, and so on. We use this information to figure out how to select our signal X events and throw away background events. All other decisions about how the data will be analyzed should also be made on these simulated X signal and background events. This also includes decisions about how systematic uncertainties will be evaluated. And it should also include any decisions about how p-values will be evaluated and under what circumstances discovery would be declared. The key point is that we make all analysis decisions without knowing the result in the experimental data. Then, after all analysis decisions have been made, we can apply the analysis designed using Monte Carlo simulations to the actual experimental data to see if there is evidence of X production. Okay. That was the basic picture. Now let's talk about some complications. What we saw above is an idealized picture. In practice, some input from data is necessary, at least for studies to determine systematic uncertainties and to do necessary cross-checks. Why is this the case? Well, first, the detector will not function perfectly according to design specifications. This means that we must look at data from the actual experiment to understand the behavior of the detector. Next, particle physics calculations cannot be done to infinite precision. So, we have to look at the experimental data to correct our Monte Carlo simulation of some physics processes. And also, the simulation of the detector will not be perfect. We need to look at the experimental data to correct our simulation of the detector response in our Monte Carlo. These issues don't have to make your analysis unblind. It is possible to do these studies using data events that are very different from your signal process. Remember that before we looked at choosing events that looked like our signal process. We could instead choose events which look nothing like our signal process. So here we show schematically how we could choose a set of events which would consist almost entirely of background events with only a negligible amount of signal sneaking in. As these events would rarely show up in our analysis, we can examine them without gleaning information which would unblind our analysis. For these studies, we should look at events which come from well-understood processes. These are processes which are well understood theoretically and which have been studied extensively at previous experiments. Okay, so this works for a lot of cases, but if it's impossible to do the necessary studies without learning too much about the experimental data, it may be necessary to do more complicated things to keep your analysis blind. The Fermilab Muon G-2 experiment went to ludicrous lengths to keep their analysis blind. If you'd like to know more about that, check out the video from Fermilab entitled "Why is the Muon G-2 experiment shifting time?" And if you'd like to know more about Muon G-2, you might want to check out the playlist Mini-Series on G-2 of the Muon, available on this channel.